Number 3. Years ago, I was on a cross-country road trip solo to a family reunion. I was supposed to make it to a friend's house, but the weather ended up being horrible and it was slow moving. Then a terrible accident happened just ahead of me. I was stuck in traffic for a while and I ended up being 5 hours behind schedule. At this point, I was exhausted and in need of a bathroom and a shower. So I pulled into a little strip motel off of some back roads. It was obviously small and dirty, but it would work in a pinch. There was a window to the outside where the check-in was. The guy that worked there eyeballed me. Back then, I was a young girl attending college. He then asked me if I was traveling alone. When I went to hand him my ID and credit card, he insisted on cash only. Red flags were going off at this point, but I managed to gather just enough cash and he tossed me the key. The room was dirty and barely bigger than the bed. The first thing I did was go to the bathroom. Then I flipped the mattress, as there were signs of bed bugs, and a moment later, I spied a roach. That was it. I was out. I decided to use the parking space instead and sleep in the back hatch of my SUV. I curled up using a suitcase for a pillow and some random clothes for a blanket, and fell asleep for about an hour. I woke up aware of someone talking on a phone outside. I glanced out to see the guy from the check-in standing outside. It was now around 3 a.m. He finished up his call and walked quietly over to my room, unlocked the door, and walked in. The lights didn't turn on, and a minute or two later he came back out, slamming the door behind him and cursing, with another guy. I hadn't seen two guys enter, so I still don't know where he came from. They angrily talked for a moment, then the check-in guy walked over to my SUV. I covered up my head quickly with a shirt. After he tried the locked door, he peered in the back seat, but between my tinted windows and blending into the general mess, he didn't notice me in the hatch. The two guys walked away to the far side of the parking lot, talking more, one of them gesturing across the street to where a diner was. While they were distracted, I climbed up to the front seat and started up the SUV. They turned around in surprise as I pulled away. I called my friends back home and told them, but I didn't want my family to worry, so I said nothing to them when I arrived. When I got back home about 3 weeks later, we figured out the name of the hotel thanks to Google Maps and called the local police. They told me the place had been closed down only days before I called. Number 2. When I was younger, each and almost every New Year, my family would pack the car and go on a road trip to visit family in Mexico. We never had any problems until one particular trip when I was 8. Like every road trip before, we left our home in North Texas around 6 p.m. in order to reach our destination the next morning, around 2 a.m. We crossed into Mexico, and this is where things got weird. When you're on the only stretch of freeway in the middle of the desert, you don't tend to freak out about having the same car behind you for miles. It was practically pitch black outside of our car windows, the only visible shapes being the dotted stars and the eerie silhouettes of cacti. We had been in Mexico for about an hour and still had a few more to drive. I remember sleeping but still being semi-conscious of what was going on around me, because I really don't have the skill to really fall asleep in a car. So when my mother suddenly spoke my dad's name, I heard her. "Miguel, that car behind us. It's been behind us since we left Laredo." My dad peeked at the car and shrugged off my mother's tension. "Lots of cars use this road. He's probably going to Reynosa or another city." And he left it at that. Despite his reassurance, my mom kept a weary eye on the car behind us. By this time, my siblings and I were hyper-aware of the car and entertained ourselves by watching the car through the gaps in the luggage that was blocking the rear window. We got tired of that pretty quick. "He's getting closer," my mother noted, and we all turned to watch the car inch closer and closer to ours. "He's too close, Miguel." And she was right. By this time, the car was practically pressed against the rear of our car, on a lonely stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere, with a few hours until daylight. It was downright scary. We couldn't do much. My dad didn't slow down, didn't stop, and he didn't speed away either. He just drove, and the car followed. The next 30 minutes were the most tense we had ever experienced. The car would ease off sometimes, only to press its blinding headlights against our rear once more, like he knew he was freaking us out and enjoying it. It was during one of the periods that the car had pulled away that Mom spotted a police car up ahead, parked on the side of the road, and she didn't miss a beat. "Miguel, pull over right now in front of the police." And he did. The car kept driving. I wonder how confused the policeman must have been as he watched my dad park the car right in front of him. The policeman came over and asked what was wrong, and my mother urgently told him everything. The car, the way it followed us and taunted us. The policeman took her claims very seriously and told us how people were victimized and had their cars stolen on these empty highways by thugs and criminals. He then offered to drive behind us for a while to make us feel safe. We drove off with the police cruiser behind us, relieved, until about 10 minutes later, when we saw something that confirmed the policeman's words and my mother's worst fears. We saw the car that had followed us pulled over on the side of the road, waiting. Number 1. I was on a cross-country road trip with a colleague. We were driving through West Texas on a major highway. In the area we were in, even the major highway was pretty desolate. There had been a truck stop or gas station about every 100 miles, and every one of them was solitary with no other buildings in sight. There weren't really any towns. The exits were places to get more gas to get to the next gas station. And my colleague had been driving for about 4 hours. I can usually drive about 8 before I get tired. I go on frequent road trips, but she could only manage about 4 or 5 before it was my turn again. We were also getting low on gas, at about a quarter tank, and you learn from road travel to fill up when you get the chance. So she was looking for a gas station as we drove along. It's really corny, but we were talking about fate and destiny and other weird shit at the time. That kind of conversation gets me keyed up and worried. So I was trying to change the subject. She took an exit while we were talking, and I got out my coffee mug so I could fill it up, as it was my turn to drive. We pulled into a typical Nowhereville gas station. It had a trailer out back. I assumed, thinking back, it was probably where the people who owned it lived. There was another car parked in front of the doors off to one side. We got out, still talking, and walked up to the double doors, each of us grabbing a door handle. The doors were locked. I turned and looked around to see if there was a sign. Sometimes places will put up, "back in 5 minutes," and I noticed several things in succession. The coffee pot inside was halfway done, brewing a fresh pot of coffee. The monitors that showed the store were visible from the outside, where we were, but all of them were showing static. There was a splash of bright red on the door in the back of the place, which was closed. I suddenly realized that I was looking at a huge streak of blood with handprints in it. Every hair on the back of my neck stood up. My friend began shaking the door and yelling, "We need to get gas." But I had already turned and walked away from the doors. I then said, "We have to leave now." I grabbed her by the arm and started propelling her back to the car. Now I noticed the other car in the lot had no plates. It was dingy and had dents. There was an empty gun rack in the window of it. I ran to the car, dragging her with me. She seemed to take forever to open the doors. The whole time she kept saying, "But we need gas." Well, I tried to explain to her, "There's blood in there. Blood." After what seemed like a year, she pulled the car out. When we were backing up, I saw through the windows that the back door to the gas station was opening. But we had pulled away before anyone came out, thankfully. I was freaking out until we were about 20 miles down the highway. I tried to call the police, but I had no signal. and I didn't get one until we had driven about 40 miles and got to a truck stop. I called the cops, they thanked me, and I never heard anything more about it. To this day, I feel like if I hadn't have freaked out, we might have met the robber, or whoever was in the back room of that place. I also wish I would have been able to find out what the hell happened there. It was a Chevron station, somewhere in the western part of Texas. There's always a reason to be afraid.
This took place mid-July of 2020. I live in the city, but I often drive to my hometown, if you can even call it that. It's a grain elevator in the middle of a cornfield, just to get away from the hustle and bustle and enjoy some peace and quiet. I prefer to go on my hikes alone, sometimes with or without my dog, depending on what animals I'm trying to observe. This time I chose to go alone, so I parked my car at the river just a few miles from the woods that I wanted to walk through. There's something about being able to see everything illuminated by the moonlight and hearing the coyotes that makes me feel at peace. I'd finally made it halfway down the dirt road that leads to the woods. I stopped for a moment because I felt a whoosh of really cold air. I thought that was so strange because it was a muggy Indiana night, around 80 degrees. I stayed there for a moment looking around to see if there was a logical explanation for the draft that I could see with my eyes, but nada. At that point, I looked directly above me and saw 3 baby raccoons trying to sleep on a branch just above my head. I remember thinking to myself, that's kind of odd, aren't raccoons nocturnal? But I just appreciated them for a moment and kept on going. I get another 500 feet down the road and whoosh, another burst of cold air. I stop again to try and figure out how that was happening. There were clear skies, 0 wind. I couldn't think of a good explanation. Before I had much more time to think on it, I heard something. To the right of me was a mostly unkempt hay and grass field, probably about knee-high at most. The moon was so bright that it was impossible to not get a good view of everything. I hear this rustling in the grass, maybe 20 feet away from me, and then it just stopped. I could see the animal now. I'll do my best to describe it. It was on all fours, but it appeared that it had the ability to be bipedal if it chose to be. I could see the nape of its neck, down to where the animal's back legs would be. The hair on its back was very strange. It had a large, thick mohawk ridge along its spine. From what I could see of the animal, I assumed that it had to weigh close to 100 pounds. Its steps were very heavy. Nothing graceful at all about it. The rest of the hair on the animal's body looked similar to that of a chimpanzee or some sort of ape. The 2 front legs were very powerful, had a broadly set stance. But the thing that messed with me the most was the sound. I'll never forget it. I was holding my breath, hoping I had just run across one of the many feral swamp dogs and that he would run off since they don't like people. I realized quickly that I was wrong. As I stood there staring, this animal started sort of loping, pacing into a figure-8 pattern. It did this for maybe 15 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. And then, the thing charged me. That's when it made the sound. There was something so wrong with its breathing. Forgive me if I'm being offensive, that's not my intent. But this animal sounded like someone who was trying to breathe but didn't have a nose, or some serious damage to its airways. It was like a snarl, growl, breath, all in one. I could hear it snap its jaws when it backed away from the bluff. This all happened so fast. Let me try to give more context. About another 500 feet away from where this happened, there's an old-fashioned settler's cabin. My first thought was to get there for safety, but before I could even make that choice, I heard a scream. Not a human scream. I'm not an expert, but through my many years of living in the woods and observing the different animals, I've got an okay ear for knowing what animal calls come from what animal. This scream sounded like a mountain lion. We don't even have those here. So basically I had to say no to that plan for safety. But wait, there's more. If you continue down the dirt road past the abandoned cabin, there's a small parking lot. The reason I didn't take my car there is because you're not supposed to be in that park at night. Well, someone else was there too. After I heard that scream, I heard a car and then started to see the headlights come over the hill toward me by the cabin. At this point, I was flipping out. The crazy animal that charged me was nowhere to be seen. There might be a crazed wildcat just a few feet away, and now some Cutlass Supreme is hauling ass in my direction. In all my wisdom and fantastic decision-making, I dove into the hayfield to hide from the car. Yes, the same field that the crazy animal was in. Thankfully, they didn't see me, but they were absolutely flying, tearing out of that place like a bat out of hell. It made me wonder if they had something to do with the screaming animal, or the weird one in the field. Needless to say, I had had enough of that night, and cut my way through other properties and woods to get back to the river where my car was. It was late summer, and my mom and I had decided that we should go out for a little spontaneous hike. We did our research, and found one trail that said it was a 4-mile round trip. Sounded easy enough. We got up early that morning, and began our trek. The entire forest had a horrible vibe. Even my mom picked up on it, and she's never been into any of the paranormal, etc. We had been walking around for hours, and this forest just seemed to get weirder and weirder. We had plenty of water and food, so I really can't say if we were just dehydrated or tired. We began to hear singing in the woods, and we just stopped and stared at each other. We had to be miles into the forest by now. Our step counter was saying that we had well surpassed the promised 4 miles. Where on earth would singing be coming from out there? We just looked at each other and began laughing. I remember her saying, "No way," and shaking her head and carrying on. It had been quite some time now, and we hadn't encountered another person on the trail. Suddenly, this man walking really fast surpasses us and rounds a bend behind a rocky hill so that we can't see him anymore. He said no words, just came up behind us and darted by. Again, me and my mom laughed and envied his athleticism until we rounded the bend ourselves to find that he was completely gone, out of sight. The path after that bend was fairly straight, and you can see far ahead of you, so there's absolutely no way he would have been able to clear that area that fast. This time my mom stops and says, "You gotta be kidding me." We're thoroughly freaked out after this. Eventually, we reach the peak, and after walking that long, you'd think that someone would probably want to stay there for a while and enjoy the view. Well, we pretty much got to the top, looked, and then left. We never discussed it, but I could tell that we were both uncomfortable and just wanted to leave. We were maybe halfway back through the trail, and the sun was beginning to set. We were moving fast. Our step counter said that we had hiked 10 miles compared to the 4 that we had initially expected. As the forest got darker, I began to hear leaves crunching behind us. I reluctantly turned and noticed that it was a buck several yards away. We hurried along as to not disturb it further, but then I began noticing that something was off. It was following us from a distance. It did so almost like a predator, hiding and peeking. I tell my mom that we were being followed by the deer, and we were pretty much at a jog at that point. The buck would not let us go. I would sometimes notice that it would catch up and follow just beside us. It always remained several yards away, though, always lurking, head down. I've lived out in the country my entire life, and have seen all the deer that you can imagine. I've never been followed by one like this. This seemed more than just curiosity. It felt horrible, predatory. I felt like I was in danger, always hearing those footsteps behind me, the feeling of being watched. Clearly, we made it out unharmed, but I really wonder if it actually intended to hurt us, or if it was just ushering us out of the forest. All in all, it was a freaky experience. Something is definitely up with those woods. This began in January of this year. I live on the Front Range of Colorado, meaning that once the mountains stop, it's basically plains for miles and miles. There are a lot of small roads and strange dead ends around these parts, and one of these is a favorite of me and my friends as it goes a long way out from the main road with basically no reason for anyone else to be there. This privacy is great for any variety of teenage shenanigans. Back in January, I was high as hell in the back of my friend's car as we drove down that road, hoping to park at the end so that we could smoke some more. As I was staring out the window, I swore that I could see the silhouette of a tall, strangely proportioned person running alongside our car. It was far out in the field, and I convinced myself that it was just my inebriated mind playing tricks on me so that I wouldn't freak out, and I didn't tell my friends so that it wouldn't bother them. We parked there for a few hours, lights off, and then went home with nothing else amiss. This actually makes me want to die now. Tonight I was headed back out to that spot with my girlfriend, both of us in separate cars. My drive up was pretty uneventful, but there was some fog that made it pretty spooky. Once we parked, my girlfriend hopped into my car and was obviously super freaked out. Once I got her to calm down, she told me what had happened. On the drive up, she looked out her window and saw a tall, dark figure, exactly like what I had seen 11 months ago, but this time, it was just standing there, staring. As soon as she made eye contact with it, her car radio turned to static. She pretty quickly turned it off and hauled ass to meet up with me. I cannot stress enough how little she believes in the supernatural, so seeing her as freaked out as she was definitely left me a little uneasy. I helped calm her down, and then hopped out of the car to take a piss. I know, literally the stupidest move ever, but at the time, I hadn't remembered what had happened to me previously, and I really had to pee. While I was out there, I definitely felt like something was watching me, but I'm a generally anxious person, so I brushed it off, as I was only going to be out there for like 30 seconds. When I stood up and went back to my door, my girlfriend looked absolutely terrified, and she was staring over my shoulder, not at me. My first thought wasn't anything supernatural. We're both girls, so I assumed that some creepy rapist had crawled out of the grass and was standing right behind me, waiting to hurt us. When I tell you I flew into the driver's seat, I really mean it. My flight reflex took 100% over. I slammed the door, looked over at her, and yelled, "What?" As far as I could tell, there wasn't anyone there. She told me that she had heard faint, female voices coming from the grass, exactly like ours. We were in an open plain, so there was no way that it was an echo. Whatever was out there was mimicking us. The mimicry is what did it for me, and I knew that we had to leave ASAP, especially as I had deciphered my hazy memories of the last time that I saw whatever it was. I didn't tell my girlfriend exactly what was wrong, just turned around so that my headlights were on her car so that she could get out there quickly. Once we were safely away, I called her and told her my thoughts. We're both incredibly spooked right now, obviously. Say their name, and it will kill them. We live in an isolated community on the Navajo reservation. My aunt and her 2 brothers were home alone, while my grandparents had left for the evening to attend a chapter house meeting. They were in the house, and like many people from the reservation, they didn't have electricity. It had been dark outside for about an hour, and my aunt and uncle were getting ready for bed. Outside, they heard noises as if someone were moving things around the house. My oldest uncle went to look out the front window and saw a large figure out by the truck. This was immensely out of the ordinary, because the closest neighbor was miles away. Whatever it was opened the truck door and began to dig through the personal items that my family had left in the vehicle. My aunt and uncle were frightened by the sight and knew that they should take action. They took out their rifle and steadied themselves to hold it up. They flung open the door and aimed the gun at the dark figure. The figure turned and began to walk toward them, totally unfazed by the weapon. My uncle pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. The figure drew closer and my aunt began to smell something like a rotting corpse. It was so strong that it made her gag. My uncle continued to pull the trigger with no luck, and the figure came closer and closer. Off in the distance, headlights were coming up the road. My grandparents were returning. The figure looked toward the lights and started to move away and tucked itself behind a tree near the house. My oldest uncle ran toward the truck with the gun. My grandfather got out of the car and my uncle pointed to the tree. This thing was poking out its head to observe what they were doing. My grandfather ran into the house and over to the stove and grabbed a handful of ashes and rubbed over the gun and placed an ash-covered bullet into the chamber. He walked out onto the porch and fired toward the tree. Whatever that thing was didn't expect the gun to go off. The gunshot echoed, and the dark figure began sprinting. My grandma chased my aunt inside, and my uncle and my grandfather went after it. There weren't many roads or paths, so as my grandfather and uncles chased the figure, the truck was bouncing and the headlights were not fixed on one particular spot. My uncle swears that whenever the headlights would hit the figure, he saw a woman, but not only that. Whoever it was running on all fours like a bear. My grandfather eventually stopped the truck, and as they neared the ditch that drops about 20 feet, he got out and began to yell in Navajo. My uncle says that he was yelling out about a local woman. He yelled that he wasn't scared, and that he knew it was her, and to leave his family alone. A few days passed, and there was news that the woman that my grandfather had yelled about had passed away. I've always been told that if you know who the Skinwalker is, say their name, and it will kill them. This is my sister's story. It happened when she must have been about 16. She's 22 this year. We live in Queensland, Australia, and this happened at my grandmother's house. Her land is quite big. There's about 7 acres for the area, considering that this happened right in the middle of a very well-populated suburb. Her house is right next to the school that my sister went to, like jump the fence next to. There are 3 houses on my grandma's street. I put street in quotations because it's basically just one giant driveway that my grandma lives at the end of. The neighbor's backyard is visible through some light trees at my grandma's front yard. The reason I explain this is because from reading a lot of Skinwalker stories, this doesn't seem like the typical setting. It must have been about 8 p.m. during winter in Australia, so it was pretty dark. She was dog-sitting my grandma's 2 very little dogs, Ruby and Crystal, for the weekend. She let them out to go to the toilet and kept an eye on them because they get distracted pretty easily. She called the dogs and only Crystal came running to the door. There's a dim light that illuminates the porch, but not her yard. She could barely see Ruby, but she was just sitting there, staring at her. She called her name a few more times in a high-pitched voice, which the dogs always come running to. Ruby took a few steps forward and just sat down again, still staring at my sister. My sister always emphasizes that Ruby looked all types of wrong. Her face appeared as if someone had tried to draw Ruby from memory, but just couldn't. She explains that it looked like a human crawling, but as if they were a dog. My sister was super freaked out. She noticed that she couldn't see or hear Ruby anywhere. She closed the door and ran into the room where both of the dogs had been sitting and where she was watching TV. And there they were, sitting on their bed, acting completely normal. She ran back to the door, and the thing pretending to be Ruby was gone. She locked the door and went straight to bed. It wasn't until recently that she brought up this story again. She had told it many times before, but considering I was about 8 the first time that she had told this story, I wasn't paying much attention to it. I recognized it as a skinwalker since I loved the episode of the Jenna and Julian podcast where they talk about them. I went to my sister and told her that that was what it was. My sister and I, being the paranormal addicts that we are, spent hours telling our sister and dad about skinwalkers. To this day, I'm still terrified that we have skinwalkers in Australia. I don't usually really believe in most myths and legends and stuff like that, but something I recently witnessed made me doubt myself. I don't know if I'm just being paranoid, but I might have had a very close encounter with something that is definitely not human and scared me out of my mind. Basically, last night I decided to go hang out with a close friend and skateboard around a bit, and I met some other friends from school down by a grocery store there. We decided to hang out for a while and walk around, and they told my friend and I that they needed to start walking home, and that they wanted to show us some apparently cool, sketchy treehouse, where people always go to chill and do drugs and whatnot on the way. We start walking that way, mostly through just suburban neighborhoods, and at that point, it's almost completely dark outside. There were around 7 of us at first, and people mostly started heading out until it was just said friend and I and a girl who had agreed to take us to see the treehouse since it was fairly close to her home. We take this pretty open path to a chain link fence with a hole in it. We go through using our phones as flashlights, and not far after there's another chain link fence with a hole in it, with the treehouse right behind, surrounded by loose bushes and a small forest. We're pretty scared at that point since it's dark, so the friend and the girl stay behind the fence while I go through the hole just outside. After looking at the treehouse for a few seconds, we start hearing rustling in the bushes. But although scared, dismiss it as a small animal, or maybe even one of our friends just messing with us since it's pretty close to several houses. Like an idiot, I keep standing outside the small hole in the fence, not moving while the rustling keeps moving around. We called out several times with no response, and the thing, whatever it was, kept shuffling and scuffing around in the bushes a little bit, rustling every few seconds. I tried looking, and could barely see it, but guessed that it was around half my height. It kept on, and after a bit we realized from the footstep patterns that it has begun to walk on 2 legs. This just about does it for us, and we get out of there, looking behind us every couple of seconds. On our way back, said friend told me earlier by the treehouse that he had caught a glimpse of something moving that was a whitish-gray color, a bit bigger than a large dog. I visited this treehouse again today with a couple more friends, and actually went up this time. But gladly, we didn't see or hear anything. And yes, I know that I would be the idiot to die in a horror movie. This last Halloween, I didn't have many friends. Only two at the time who wanted to celebrate together. One eventually bailed, leaving me and my friend Rob to hang out alone. It was freezing, and I had to bike out to our usual rendezvous place, which was about equidistance from our houses. This place was a gas station adjacent to a very large field that was occasionally used for soccer games. Once we both arrived to the gas station, we went inside, got water and sunflower seeds, and left. Due to the pandemic, we decided not to risk exposure by trick-or-treating, so we went to go walk in this field. It was around 9:30 at night, and pitch black outside. We don't live near any major cities, so our only light was from the moon and the stars. The sky was clear that night, so around 5 minutes in, we became entranced by the stars in the sky, walking forward with our heads craned back, looking up. This went on for a minute or two before we thought we heard shuffling near us. We turned to the right to see a dark figure lit very dimly by the extraterrestrial light. I'm a rather small person, and Rob isn't too much bigger, so the littlest things normally will put us on edge. But this thing was different. It looked bipedal, though it seemed to be bent over with a near hunched back, and there were protrusions from its head, either horns or ears. It was difficult to tell. I immediately emitted a short scream and ran to the side toward Rob. I knew he occasionally carried a hunting knife, as he's more of an outback type of person than me. The thing then bent down to walk on all fours and started yipping strangely, like a small dog almost. My friend grabbed the back of my jacket and yanked me back and yelled at me to run. He then pulled out the hunting knife. The creature was pacing while still making strange noises. It looked like it was about to get closer before Rob threw the knife at the thing and got up to run. He yelled an exasperated "shit" as he started to sprint away. As we ran, I heard a voice repeatedly echo Rob's, also saying "shit." We ran all the way back to the gas station and to where we parked our bikes. Wordlessly, we decided it was best to just go inside the brightly lit station and just wait for our nerves to calm down. We haven't been able to hang out since due to the virus, but I doubt that we will go walking in that field at night again. Last year, I was living in a small mountain town in central southern Colorado in the Rio Grande National Forest. Super small town. Ute natives were tragically killed in the whole area. I don't usually get creepy vibes when I'm there, but it's definitely weird in many ways. I was in my car at 2 a.m. with a friend. We were parked outside our house looking down the road with the only streetlight across the street lighting up the area. From 15 yards in front of us, we see a large animal emerge from darkness and catch the light. We started asking each other what it was, commenting on its size. It was like the size of a small horse or a big deer. It walked toward us. It stood 1 yard away from my door. We were frozen. We were unable to move, and we just stared at it with it so close to us, and I said, "Is that a wolf?" It's all I could think that it could be. It was tall, completely silver. It looked like a wolf from a movie. As it stood there, it looked up to the sky, and then left, and then to the right. Then it ran away toward the large cliffs at the back of the town where the abandoned mines are, and a large forest begins. We were stunned. We stayed frozen and silent for minutes, until we just started laughing. We eventually calmed down and went inside, but were confused as hell. After that, I told some coworkers, thinking how cool it was, that I saw a wolf. They all said that it was impossible, that no wolves had lived there for decades. So I do some research, and they're right. No wolves have been here for like 40 years, and it would be a miracle if I had seen one, especially a gray wolf. As I look at more pictures of wolves, my memory becomes clearer. What I saw was too tall and silver to even be a gray wolf. My friend and I have not forgotten one detail of this story. I'm sure it wasn't a dog. If it was, then that was the biggest dog in existence. I remember the world washing away as I stared at its shining fur. It was possibly the most majestic animal I have ever seen. There were chills covering my body, and I could barely breathe. Do you think that I saw a skinwalker? I live in-house of an animal shelter as I'm the on-site vet and do most of the dog's medical needs. We're a non-profit organization, so the majority of our money comes from adoptions, but we are also located out in the middle of the desert with about 20 acres, give or take a couple of acres. I started working here last month, and I have had so many strange occurrences during my nighttime walkthroughs. Living on site means that I room and board here, and typically you get rats and squirrels, small vermin who will poop and agitate the animals. But last night, I was walking around with my flashlight, and one of the dogs who is very calm and chill, his name is Gizmo. He sort of protects me as I've had a raccoon attack last week and had to get a couple shots and some stitching. He comes with me for protection as he's a guard dog of sorts. He's a pit bull terrier. I was counting our dogs and double-checking everyone had gotten their meds, and the cages were locked. I got to the back where trucks can pull in and go out onto the open lot and see what I assumed was a very large dog. I thought that it was one of our big dogs that got out of his pen, so I approached it. But Gizmo started growling and whimpering and pulling back. I flashed my light, and the dog was hunched over still. I pulled Gizmo and he wouldn't budge. I walk over to the kennel where I thought the dog had escaped, but the fuzzball was in his pen. I flash the light in the direction of the dog again, thinking that it's a stray, and see it standing on its hind legs. I don't think anything of it, but that it's a big dog, and that it'll tear Gizmo to pieces, so I release him from my waist leash, and he takes off back to the gate, and sits there whimpering and barking still. I turn to look back at the dog or thing, and keep my light shining, and get my phone out and have 911 ready to dial. That thing stood tall on its two hind legs, and honestly, I was probably stupid to go closer. I got closer, but it started running away on its two hind legs, and it just sent chills down my spine. Gizmo came back to me, and started pulling me away. As I closed and locked the fence, I felt like it was out there again, and so I walked back quick to my room and let Gizmo sleep with me. My boss told me it's my mind playing tricks, but I didn't tell her Gizmo saw and felt the presence as well. This happened a couple years ago on a friend's property. His property line comes up to a heavily wooded area where strange stuff is heard at night. We were hanging out in a small shed out back. I had just introduced one of my childhood friends to this guy, and we were hanging out when we hear his pit bulls going crazy barking and growling at the woods. Then, an extremely loud, high-pitched shrieking comes from the woods, which made my childhood friend jump. As soon as the shriek was heard, his pit bulls came running in, one of them hiding under my chair. A minute or two later, we see 3 sets of very large, opalescent eyes staring into the shed. We started hearing small, light shrieks as they moved closer to us. I could just barely make out a completely white, gray, bony form before my buddy tells us to cover our ears. As soon as I cover my ears, he pulls out an old revolver and fires 3 shots out the open door, chasing these things off. I looked over at my childhood friend, who just looks like he had a heart attack. My buddy puts the gun on the small table and tells me to take him home, which I gladly did. I've been back over there a few times, and every now and then I hear a shriek coming from the woods, accompanied by my buddy pulling back the hammer of his gun. Back in 2018, I decided to move out to another state. My friend's mom said that she had seen me a few times on our street at 4 a.m. while she was driving to work. I came back in 2019 and stayed for a couple of weeks and then left to a different state. A couple of nights after I had left, my friend says that she was getting out of her friend's car to head to the front door when she sees me heading to the front door with my 2 red suitcases and the guitar case that I had. She said that once she got out, I turned around and went across the street, going in front of the headlights, where she got a good look at me. I was wearing the same clothes that I had left in, had the same suitcases, and the same guitar case. They say it's a skinwalker, which would make sense because the entire area we live in were Indian burial sites. The area has always been supercharged with energy, but from my understanding, skinwalkers imitate animals? I'm not sure what it was. Definitely wasn't a ghost, because I'm still alive. But now I'm back here with my friend at the same house, and I would really like to know what could be impersonating me. Alright everyone, I hope you enjoyed these true scary stories, and if you did, make sure to hit those like and subscribe buttons for me along with that notification bell to stay updated on all the latest content. To have your own horror story featured, feel free to submit it to me via the email included below in the description. Also down there you can find the links to other playlists with lots more awesome creepy content for you to enjoy. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon. Until then, don't forget to embrace the terror.